agreed to it. It's my decision. I just say I didn't come up with the idea. I'm giving credit. It's not blame. It's giving credit.
There you go.
So, anyway, 1 Samuel chapter 17 is where we're at today. Last week, God had rejected Samuel. God hadn't rejected Samuel at all. God rejected Saul as... Maybe you should teach, Nathan. You probably could do it better than I could. God had rejected Saul as king, and so he had chosen a man after his own heart. And after sending Samuel to Jesse's house to go and sacrifice, and he invited Jesse and his sons, and paraded 7 of Jesse's sons before Samuel. And Samuel, seeing no king among Jesse's 7 sons, had to go send for the 8th son, who was out in the fields tending the sheep. Found the 8th son David, and God had revealed that David was going to be the next king of Israel. And so Samuel anointed David king in front of Jesse, in front of the sons, in front of the town of Bethlehem. Mind you, not a large town, but in front of the whole town as they were there for the sacrifice. And then we reflect back on Saul, who had come to the point where God's spirit had left him, and he was bothered by a distressing or an evil spirit. His wise advisor said, what we're going to do is we're going to find a harper to play for you, and when this evil spirit comes upon you, this harper will play for you, and you will be refreshed, and the evil spirit will not bother you anymore. And in discussing, somebody said, hey, I know this kid, the son of Jesse, who is great with the harp, and he's the valiant little guy. He's a good fighter, and he plays well on the harp, and the Lord is with him, so he'd be a great candidate. Why don't we bring him in? And lo and behold, it happens to be David. And so David is brought before Saul, and sure enough, David's a wonderful musician. His harping helps out Saul, and Saul brings him into his court, into the palace, and David becomes a regular fixture there, becomes one of the armor bearers. And again, the idea is that Saul probably had several, if not many, people in this position. We're going to see that it's probably true that he had more than one armor bearer and had several people doing this. And what else was I going to say? Oh, and Saul seemed to very much appreciate, to the point that the passage said that he found favor in Saul's sight, and that Saul greatly loved David. So Saul ends up finding favor with and greatly loving the guy who's going to replace him. So we come to chapter 17. Chapter 17 seems to happen shortly after chapter 16. So we're continuing in the narrative. Chapter 17, we come back to our favorite enemy of Israel at this time, the Philistines, and they're causing more trouble again. And Saul and the Philistines get into a little conflict, and we see God exalting David and showing how he has chosen him once again. And we see a little bit of David's faith and his trust in God through chapter 17. So before we dig in here, let's go ahead and we will open in prayer. I am going to ask, let's see, who hasn't prayed in a long while to open here? I should be more planning on this. Where's Josiah? Wasn't he here this morning? He's sick. Okay, I thought I saw him. Nathan, I'm going to have you pray.
Thank you, Lord, for this day. I just pray that you would give us attentive ears and guide us in your mind, that we would learn a lot from your word, and that we would review it throughout the week and study it
Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 17. Need a reader. Lemuel.
Now the Philistines gathered their armies gathered about, and were gathered together at Tob, which is going to Judah, and encamped between Tob and Mizpah, and Ephes and Min. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle against the Philistines stood battle against stood on a mountain on one side, Israel stood on the mountain on the other side of the valley.
So pass that. Grab that. So here we see that the Philistines and Israel gather for battle. And I'm going to go quickly through some parts of these because there's 50-some verses this morning, and I'd like to get through this passage. It's all one cohesive story. So looking at these paces, Socho is 15 miles west of Bethlehem. So if Bethlehem's a little south of Jerusalem, going 15 miles west, it's heading towards Philistia. So it's about halfway in between Judah and the land of the Philistines. Azziah is about 17 miles northwest of Bethlehem, so it's a little bit more this way, maybe closer to Dan. And they're meeting on two mountains, mind you, in Israel, large hills, with a valley in between. Obviously, they're going to be on the two mountains because these are more defensible. You don't want to attack uphill. And they're going to come and meet in the valley. So they're coming downhill and meeting in the valley to fight the war. Pretty standard setup here. Not attacking uphill, but attacking downhill towards each other. So they're camped there. Neither one wants to go in the valley and have to go attack uphill, so they're at a little bit of a standoff. None of them wants to be down in the valley attacking each other. So as long as they stay on their hill, the other army can't go up and attack against each other. So I think this is where the next section comes from. Why you say, why didn't Israel go attack the Philistines? Well, they don't want to go down the valley and come back up at them. Why didn't the Philistines attack Israel? Same reason. They don't want to go down the valley and attack back up at Israel. So they're both on their mountains and camp. As long as they stay in the high ground, they're in good position. And so they're at a standstill here, kind of facing each other, not knowing what to do, who's going to make the first move. And so we get to chapter 17, verse 4. Who's our next reader? Nathan.
And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in his span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. And a shield bearer was before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel, and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants, and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together. Then when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid.
So a giant issues a challenge. Now, why is he willing to issue a challenge here? Okay, number one, he figures he has the advantage, right? So he's looking at the Israelites and saying, I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I don't even exercise. Some of you get that reference. So he figures he's better than the rest of them. We're going to find out later from Saul that the Israelites think that he's better than the rest of them. So that's one thing. Number two, the Philistines again see that they're both on this mountain. Again, let me draw this up for you, just to make sure that we're clear on this. You got the mountain here, you got a valley, and then you got a mountain. So you have one army's camped over here, and one army's camped over here. Look at how mighty these armies are, right? So, if this army comes down here and tries to attack uphill, they're just going to rain down their spears and arrows on them. And if this army comes here, they're going to rain down their spears and arrows. So the Philistines know they can't go attack them, and the Israelites know they can't go attack them. So let's just finish this off. We'll have a man-to-man contest. Winner takes all. The armies don't want to be out here forever, right? They're not doing anything. They're both just standing here on their hills, waiting for somebody to do something. Nobody's doing anything. I think that's even part of this. They don't want to be out here forever.
And of course, the whole area is pretty shaky.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. This is Israel. I'm sure this is a whole lot of fun for all of them. And the giant's probably like, let's just get this over with. And he's confident. He's going to beat any one of them, right? So he goes out there. So he's this giant. His name's Goliath.
What is that? His hot air fills his balloon.
This hot air fills his balloon. Very,
It makes him bigger.
yeah. Oh, he's already big enough as it is. We'll see here. His name's Goliath. He's from Gath. We know where Gath is. That's one of the big Philistine cities. Their capital. He's 6 cubits in a span. Looking this up, he's 9 feet tall, about 9 feet 9 inches tall. Very large person. His gear, he had a bronze helmet. Now, I don't know if you know anything about bronze. Bronze is not light. So just that he's wearing a bronze helmet, being a 9 foot 9 inch tall guy, that's going to be a big helmet because I'm sure his head is fairly large then. His gear, he has a coat of mail, 5,000 shekels. That's his armor is 125 pounds. That's about what 5,000 shekels of bronze is. That's a very heavy piece of armor that he's carrying around. He has bronze armor on his legs. He has a bronze javelin that he's carrying across his shoulder. He has a spear. It says it's like a weaver's beam. I don't know what a weaver's beam looks like, but I can't imagine that a weaver's beam is a small thing. No. If Pastor Jim says no, I'll believe him. A spear, the spear is 600 shekels, so it's a 15-pound spear. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you're waving around in battle and swinging it and throwing it at people and stuff, 15 pounds is a lot of weight to continually be throwing around in battle.
That's the spear end, not the actual wood part of the spear.
Okay, so that's the spear end. So
And the spear itself would be about 4x4, roughly.
So a hefty spear that he's throwing around. And then he has, and this is just the stuff he's carrying, he has a guy carrying a shield in front of him because he has all this other stuff he's carrying around. So this guy is like the tank of soldiers. I mean, this guy is not only huge, but he is well outfitted. He is impenetrable. He is like the technology of the Philistines. He has everything he needs to beat you down. Not only is he big, but he's well equipped. So he has confidence, and rightfully so at this point.
Does Goliath mean tank?
I don't think it means tank, but so his challenge is simple. You guys choose a man. You can choose any man you want. You Israelites, just give me a man, choose a man. We'll fight man to man. If the Jewish man wins, and I got this backwards, I think. Yeah, I did. It should be the Philistines will serve Israel. If the Jewish man wins, so switch those around. The Philistines will serve Israel. Yeah, I got it. I got it backwards. I changed it around like twice. I still got it backwards in here. I'm sorry about that. But if the Jewish man wins, the Philistines will come and serve you, Israel. But if I win, if Goliath wins, the Israelites will serve the Philistines. We'll make it very simple. Winner takes all. The whole nation will serve you. Now, we'll see later that that's not what happens. So, at this point, let me stop for a second. Let me ask you a question. The big giant Philistine is coming out and challenging Israel. Who is the candidate who should be answering the call from Israel? Why? He's the guy who's head and shoulders above all the Israelites, right? He's their big giant champion. And besides that, he's the guy that God picked out to be the guy to deliver Israel, right? So he's the best candidate. Saul should be like, okay, I'm coming. I'll get you. And we'll see by David's response, if Saul had the same attitude as David, this should be a no-problem match for Saul, because not only is Saul the biggest and strongest, and also we learned earlier, Saul's one of the two guys that actually has weapons in Israel. But Saul has another advantage that the Philistine doesn't have. And we'll talk about that later. But so Saul should be answering the call at this point. So his challenge is choose a man. Here's his terms. Now his taunt. So he defiles the armies of Israel. Now again, he knows that he's intimidating. So he says he's going to defy the armies of Israel. I defy you to bring me a man. Give me a man to fight. And what's Israel's response? They're dismayed. We can't do it. We're doomed. We can't fight this guy. It's hopeless. There's not a single person in all of the army of Israel that sees any hope to beat Goliath. They have no hope. They have no idea of how they're going to ever beat this guy Goliath.
They weren't just afraid, they were greatly afraid.
They were greatly afraid. They were without hope in the world. I mean, and we're going to see later, they were terrified. In fact, and this line is probably extending throughout this valley. Later on, it talks about that when he came around, so he was probably walking up and down the line, calling out the challenge as he walked along. When he come by, they would flee that section of wherever they were at. So they wouldn't even stay and listen. They'd run away from wherever he was challenging from.
So that's his mockery. Why did you even bother lining up against them?
Yeah. And they were dismayed by it. So Goliath comes on, issues this challenge, and Israel is dismayed. Israel's hopeless. Israel is just scared out of their wits by this giant.
He didn't just do this in one. We'll find out he didn't do it just one day.
Oh, no.
He did this for a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And the more he did it, the more fearful they became.
Let's find out how long he did it. Let's read the next section. Samuel 17, 12 through 22. Matt's hand went up very quick on that.
Now David was the son of that Jesse of Bethlehem of Judah. His name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons, and the man was old, advanced in years, and days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone and followed Saul to the battle. The names of his 2 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn Mishman, Benadab, and Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David was taken away and his twin sons, Saul, the leading father, to the Bethlehem. And the Philistines drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Then Jesse said to his son, David, take now from your brothers an ephah of this dry grain and 10 loaves, and one to your brothers to eat. He gave the 10 pieces to the captain of 8,000, and see how your brothers fared, and bring back news of him. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were around you all, fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, washed the sheep of the people, and took the grain, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going up to fight, and starting to night. But Israel and the Philistines had gone up in another way, coming against the army. And David left his supplies in the hands of the archers, ran to the army, and came and did his brother.
So I call this David's routine during wartime. So remember, David is serving Saul. He's one of the armor bearers. And it starts off by talking about David's family. Now, we've already been a little bit introduced to David's family in the last chapter. It gives us a little more detail about what they were doing. Jesse's old. Obviously, he has 8 sons now. The 3 oldest went to battle. They were old enough to fight in the army, so they were in Saul's army. And David was with Saul, being the armor bearer. But David also had responsibilities at home. He was the shepherd of the family. He was taking care of the sheep. So he would go back and forth, and he would take care of the sheep, and then he would go to the army. And so when he didn't have duties in the army, he'd go home and take care of the sheep, and then he'd come back to the army. And so we would see David do this. He occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed the father's sheep at Bethlehem. And while he's doing this, we find out that the Philistine was making this challenge for 40 days and 40 nights. So morning and evening he was going out and challenging the Israelites, and for 40 days and 40 nights the Israelites were sitting scared of the Philistines. And during this time, Jesse, concerned about his sons because they've been out here at the battle for 40 days, he wants to take his sons some food. So he sends grain and bread and cheese to take to his sons, and it also sounds like to their captains. So it was not only providing for his own sons, but to provide for the men who were in charge of them. Probably a little bit like a tax, but providing for the army there. And he sends David out to do that. And while he's there, and notice that Jesse says, and get some news of them, find out what's going on, find out if they're okay. You know, that's the dad saying, want to know what's going on. They didn't have, try to turn on CNN or Fox News and find out how the battle was going. So find out what's going on. I want to know. And so he sends David out to get some information too. And so David goes to the battle, and it sounds like there may be some skirmishes going on, or maybe there's just some shouting and people lining up battle arrays. But right now, the battle's not really doing a whole lot. It's the Philistines shouting his challenge, and the two armies are drawn up against each other. And for 40 days, they've been sitting here waiting for something to happen. So, David arrives as his father commands him. What happens? 1 Samuel 17:23. Lynn.
Then as he talked with them, there was a champion, Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and shall be that the man who killed him, the king will enrich with great riches, and give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who killed Israel, the Philistines, and take away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine? They should defy the armies of the living God. And people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who killed him.
So David hears about Goliath while he's there. He's been sent to gather news, and he happens to hear about Goliath. So he gets there, and Goliath's giving out his little challenge. And this happens while David is talking to, it says them. We don't know if it's his brothers or if it's the captains, because he was supposed to bring food to his brothers and to the captains. And so David hears Goliath's challenge. And while he hears that, we hear that this is where we see that the Israelites flee from wherever Goliath is. So they're running away from Goliath. And we hear the Israelites gossip about it as they're talking about what's going on here. And the Israelites' gossip is, have you seen him? Have you seen this guy? He's come to defy Israel. And then whoever kills him, the king will do these three things. He's going to enrich him with great riches. He's going to give him his daughter as a wife and exempt his father's house from taxes. You know, there's the two sure things in life, death and taxes. Well, you're going to get out of one of them. No taxes. Now, some commentators said that we're not sure if this is necessarily true or not, because we don't ever see that Saul actually promised this, and we don't ever see him say this to David that he was going to do this. So maybe this was idle gossip that the men were making this up, but this was what the story was going around the camp, that you get these three things. And David did get Saul's daughter as a wife, and that didn't work out very well. We'll see later on as we study through the book. So David hears this. And so David goes up to the men and says, what? And you see this is kind of his attitude. David spoke to men saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine? This is kind of this disbelief thing. This is like me going like, whoever opens the door for Pastor Jim, I'm going to give $1,000 after class. And somebody going, you're going to give $1,000 for whoever opens the door for Pastor Jim? You're kidding, right? No, I'm going to do that. Yeah, this is kind of the attitude I think I read in here about what David's saying. This is what you're going to do for such a little thing? You know, it's like David has this attitude of disbelief, like, this is so much for such a small thing? You guys are kidding, right? And you can see by how he talks about this, who takes away the reproach from Israel. This is what you're going to do? And look at it, he questions the reward, he questions the worthiness of the Philistine, who kills this uncircumcised Philistine, this unbelieving, un-God-fearing Philistine? The one who defies the armies of God. This guy hasn't just gone against us, he's gone against God, and all you have to do is kill him and you get these things? Really? You can see David's disbelief in this.
David wasn't there, and that's you almost wonder about, I'm going to use the word providence of God. He's not there at the battle for 40 days.
Yeah.
He's an armor bearer. He should be with the king, but he's not. He's at home taking care of his sheep.
Yeah.
And there he is. And now he comes.
Yeah.
He's there. And I almost wonder what would happen had he been there earlier. But
Yeah.
That moved because he wasn't.
In God's providence, this is when he's here now, and he's questioning the men like, you got to be kidding me. This is nothing. And the men are like, yeah, this is what the king's going to do. And so David's like, I mean, this is how I read it. Maybe I'm reading this wrong, but this is how I see it. Is David is like just baffled by this. This is so much for so little here. Why isn't anybody doing this? Why isn't somebody running out there and just taking this guy down? This is so easy. Guys, come on.
They should have learned from the fact that Jonathan
Took the whole garrison with him. Yeah.
and destroyed.
And there were a lot of comparisons in the commentaries I read between David's faith and Jonathan's faith, between these two stories here. And it's interesting, and you see why later on we see such a love between Jonathan and David, I think, because they had this like faith in God, that they trusted that God could deliver them no matter what the odds. Ken, your hand went up briefly.
Just that sounds like there could be a sense of, you should be willing to do this regardless of whether there's a reward.
Yeah.
You're soldiers.
Yeah, exactly.
You're soldiers of
This is your job, and of God even. Yeah.
Of the army of the people of God.
Yeah. And we'll see later just where David's faith is at. It's like, how can you not trust God in this situation? Especially since this Philistine has not put himself against men. He's put himself against the God of hosts and against the armies of the living God. Do you think God's not going to defend himself? I want to look at a passage later, so if you have your Bibles, make sure they're handy. We're going to look at one later. So people confirm that this is what they're going to do. Now, let's look at David's encouraging brother. So who wants to read verses 28 to 30? Miriam. So Eliab gets angry with David. And why is Eliab angry with David?
That's his job as the oldest brother.
It's his job as the oldest brother. We'll talk about it in just a second. So Eliab hears David speak. So my guess is early when David was talking with people, I thought he was speaking with them. I think David was speaking with the captains probably when he was delivering food, because it sounds like Eliab wasn't right there. But Eliab hears David speaking with the men about this, and that's why it gives me the sense that David was speaking in disbelief about, how can you guys not be doing this, killing this giant? And Eliab's angry. Now, part one makes me think he's angry because Eliab hasn't gone out there and challenged the giant. And David's saying, why aren't you guys doing this? And it's kind of making Eliab look like a coward, and Eliab doesn't want to look like a coward. And here's his little brother saying, you're being cowardly not doing this. So Eliab feels a little guilty. So there's number one. Your little brother's making me look bad. Number two, what just happened in chapter 16? Little brother was anointed king over big brother. Right? And remember, when big brother walked in, Samuel's first reaction was, here's the Lord's anointed. And maybe big brother thought, yep, I'm the guy. And God said, no, you're not. And maybe that's still irking that big brother, that he saw his little brother anointed. And so I think there's a couple things gnawing at Eliab's heart, and it proves that Eliab's not worthy of being king, if those two things are true there. But so Eliab, his response is he's going to rebuke David. He's going to lay into him, and look at what the complaints of his rebukes are. His anger was aroused here. He questions David's purpose in here. Why did you come down here? Well, why did David come down there? Dad sent him. That's a pretty good reason to come down there. It's Father's Day, so hey, obey your father, right? You should do it today, right? Thumbs down, Abigail, really? Wow. Okay. David's obeying his father. Why are you down here? Well, Dad sent me with the food, and he told me to get news. I'm getting news. I mean, David has a good reason. He questions what he's doing is right. You left those few sheep that we have in the wilderness. That's our livelihood. You're going to ruin us. You're going to ruin our family. You're so irresponsible, David. Just leaving those sheep out. I cannot believe that. And then he questions what he's doing is right. I know your pride and insolence. You came down here just to see you just wanted to see the excitement. You wanted to see the action. You were bored at home and you just wanted to have some fun. See the big boys fight. What's that? No. And he's doing what his father told him to do, which and David could have answered all these three things, and David didn't bother to even answer it. What have I done now? Is there not a cause? He kind of walks away from it like it's not even worth answering it. So he gives a very short argument. I think he just didn't want to get into the argument. But then David goes and he talks to other people, confirming, is this what Saul said? Is this what's going on with the giant? So David's still gathering news. But Eliab, we see Eliab's heart here, not really king material for him. So very interesting how Eliab reacts. Let's move on. Samuel 17:31 through 37. Abigail, sorry.
Now when the words David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he said to him, Then David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with his children. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against the Philistines and fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from you. But David said to Saul, Your servant keeps his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took the lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its ears and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, O Lord, deliver me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear. He will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Go, and the Lord be with you.
So David volunteers to fight the giant. I think having talked to the other men and seeing that nobody's going to do it, David's all ready to go. So Saul hears of David's words. David's asking around, and it gets back to Saul, hey, there's this young kid talking to everybody and wondering why nobody's fighting the giant. So Saul brings him over and says, let's talk to this kid. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail. Let no one be afraid. I'll fight the giant. This 13-year-oldish kid steps up to the impressively tall king and says, I'll fight him. David will fight the Philistine. So Saul says, you can't do it. He's 9 feet 9 inches tall, fully armored. You're a youth. Goliath is a man of war from youth. It sounds like that. And I'm thinking that, these giants were bred from stock of giants. I mean, there's like generations of giants, and they probably trained them from when they were young and trained them to fight, trained them to be warriors. I mean, these guys were warriors upon warriors upon warriors upon warriors, generation after generation. So he's like, these guys are like career warriors. They've been warriors all their life. You're just a youth. You cannot beat him. There's no possible way. I'm not sending you out to get slaughtered by this guy. Saul has at least that much compassion left in him. I'm not going to send a kid to get killed by this guy. And David appeals, first of all, to his experience. He says, look, I've kept sheep. What does that have to do with fighting a giant? You kept sheep. Big deal. I've kept sheep. And guess what? The sheep were attacked by lions. They were attacked by bears. And when that happened, I fought the lions and I fought the bears. And I struck the lions dead and I struck the bears dead as a boy. And the giant, guess what? He's going to be like one of them. He's going to be like a lion and like a bear because he defiled the Lord God. Which reminds me, it just proves that David was a fan of the Green Bay Packers because he fought the Lions and he fought the Bears and he's going to go fight the Giants. Sorry, that was terrible. We're going to delete that out of the tape. I actually got that from one of my faith professors, so don't blame me for that one. That's a blame. Jeff, so you could say that. Anyway, so, but he relates his experience that if I can take on a lion, I can take on a bear, I can take on this giant. But then he also goes a little further. David also appeals to God's protection. And look in verse 37. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me. God has protected me all along. You see, David knows it's not just him alone. It's not just him who, I got this great method for killing lions and bears. You see, I got this strategy here, and lions, they act this way, so I do this, and my great strategy is, no. It says, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. David realizes who's really in charge. David realizes who really has his hand over his life. David realizes who's in control. Now, David last chapter was just anointed king by God's priest. And so if God says, you're going to be the king, and David says, well, God wants me to kill this Philistine, guess what? God better protect me if he wants to make me king, because I'm not the king yet. If he's going to make me king, then I'm supposed to fight the Philistine. God better keep me alive for that, otherwise I'm not going to have much of a kingship, am I? Can he trust God? He certainly can, right? God's sovereign, can control that. So God has delivered him in the past from the paw of the lion, the power of the bear. Then God can deliver me from this Philistine. I can trust God. And he tells that to Saul. God has delivered me before. I can trust him now. It's no different. It's no different than in these situations. I had to go save the sheep from the lion and the bear, and I trusted God, and he didn't fail me. So I'm going to go out there, and I'm going to trust God, and he's not going to fail me this time either. Saul doesn't have an argument for that. He's like, okay, I can't argue with that. Go ahead, go, and may the Lord be with you. So Saul gives up on arguing with David. You're too small, but I can't argue with anything he said.
David, I wonder how much Saul knew as to David's future.
I don't.
Because
Yeah.
the scripture feels silent about that up until later.
Yeah, I don't think Saul knows at this point that David's been chosen to be king.
Yeah, and what the Spirit hasn't been taken from him
Yeah.
and given to David, maybe he would be thinking, this is just speculation, and it doesn't mean anything, but maybe he's thinking, this might be a good way to get him as the next king.
Well, and we're going to see a little bit later in this passage that Saul's not making connections very quick here anyway. So I think Saul really at this point doesn't even know really who David is at this point even. So we'll read on and we'll see that in just a second. So let's read verses 38 through 40. Jana, you want to read? Okay, so Point 7 here, David arms himself. If you're going to go to a fight, you got to have some weapons, right? So David tries out Saul's armor. Saul says, here's my helmet, my bronze helmet. Here's my coat of mail. Here's my sword. Here you go. I'm going to arm you to the teeth. You'll be ready to fight this giant. Now, how tall is Saul? Head and shoulders above all the men. David's still a boy yet. I mean, I don't think he's fully grown even at this point. And he's trying this on, and he's having trouble walking it. The idea of not tested is kind of the idea of he's not used to it. It's unfamiliar to him. He's unable to figure out how to make it work. Obviously, it's all much too big for him. And so this is almost comical, right? Watching this young kid trying to take this heavy armor and this heavy helmet, and you can see the helmet flopping over his eyes and the sword dragging on the ground. He can't move. He's like, this isn't going to work. This is ridiculous. So what does he take? He takes his staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones. Why those things? That is what he's familiar with. That's what he had when he was shepherding. That's what he had when he fought the lion and the bear. It worked for him before. He's going to take it again. He's taking what he's familiar with. There's a wisdom in that. You know, sometimes you see these things like these fatty things about evangelism type things, like this new fad of evangelism. Do evangelism this way, and people try it and they stumble over and stuff. Sometimes just do what you're familiar with. Like if you're comfortable just sharing, you have 5 verses you like to share the gospel with, use those 5 verses. Or if you have one verse that you have one verse you share the gospel with, use that verse. If you're comfortable with it, you're familiar with it, don't change the plan. You're familiar with that. If you have a track you use because you're familiar with it, use that track. Those kind of things. Sometimes trying to change things up because it's a fad and somebody tells you this is the way you have to do it. No, you don't have to do it that way. Just give people God's word. Do what you're familiar with. It's not hard. It's not overthinking it. David is overthinking it by trying Saul's armor and says, nope, I'm not overthinking it. I'm taking what I'm familiar with. I got my staff. I got my stones. I'm going to go out and meet the giant with this. And at this point, everybody's probably going, this is going to be a disaster, right? Super tinky Philistine guy versus little boy with a stick. And as we go on here, Goliath certainly does think that. Let's read verses 41 through 44. Who's next? Marie.
So the Philistines came and they formed on with David. And the man bore his shield and before him. And when the Philistines looked around and saw David, he was ashamed of him. For he was only a young, lean, and good looking. So the Philistines said to David, "Am I a God that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistines cursed David by his side. And the Philistines said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field."
So Goliath mocks David. I think Goliath has to almost be in disbelief here. So Goliath draws near. He sees David, says he disdained him. I think that's probably an understatement. He's probably like, he probably just cannot believe what he's seeing here. A young shepherd boy with a stick coming to fight him. He disdained him because he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. He wasn't a warrior. He is expecting an armored guy coming out to meet him, and he sees a shepherd coming out to meet him. This who Israel's sending to fight him? You have got to be kidding me. Yes.
So to some degree, this disheartening, almost as threatening as his threat filled his parachute, this has to be undermining.
Almost disrespectful to him, like.
No, that is like, well, what is the secret? What is the secret? The little body.
Maybe he sees it as a trap or something like that, or
Nobody's ever assaulted him with something little.
yeah. He doesn't know what to do. Or maybe, I don't know. Who knows what he's thinking?
I think his focus is really on David, and you see, like you say, this young kid, I'm a big man, and this is a boy.
Yeah.
You get it, just like that comes up and slaps him right in the face. Bang, okay, now.
And you're probably right even because, probably if he didn't see him as a threat, he'd probably just cut him down. But he goes to a verbal attack, almost like I better try to discourage this guy because I don't know what's coming at me. So he speaks. He mocks David's weapon first of all. Am I a dog that he comes to with sticks? I mean, you're right. If he wasn't a threat, he just like swing his sword and kill him, right? But he seems to have to try to figure out what's going on here. I don't know. It's interesting because what does Goliath think here? He's probably more confused than anything. Or
Well, actually, if you look at it, David actually has one of the advantages here. Goliath is, he has the strength advantage, and he has a lot of armor, so you can see low. David's got no armor, he's light and fast, has a better range attack.
so David does have some advantages.
He was looking at it just like his brother did. He's a tiny guy, he was a big guy. It is, I think, looking at his face value, or I don't think this guy can keep his head at all. He's a huge guy.
Yeah.
He lives in society today, and you have a big adult, some young kid comes up, he's going to think nothing of him. You don't know what he's, God, what David here, but society today, you see a young little kid, he knows karate, that kid just Hank doesn't know about that. He doesn't know about that. Just he's a little kid. Like, I'm going to dominate him, I'm going to mock him. I'm not going to do it at the same time, so they're all one. So,
And then you mount them, you dress it, that's all true, and then you can thought real quick, and then you start running quick and have to attack on it.
So anyway, so he goes with a verbal attack instead of. Yeah, so maybe he feels threatened by David at this point. Anyway, so he attacks three ways. He mocks David's weapon. Why do you come with me with a stick? Am I a dog? And one of the commentators says he kind of is a dog. That's the Israelites looked at uncircumcised people as dogs. He curses David by his gods. And so he's kind of threatening David's God, in fact, because he's threatening him with his gods. And then he threatens David's life. Come to me and I will give you your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And you'll see that David kind of turns around all those threats in the next section here. So he mocks David's weapon, he curses David by his God, so he's mocking David's God, and he threatens David's life. And David turns around those three things on him. Who's next to read? Hannah. Number 9 here, David responds in faith. Goliath mocks. David responds in faith. So David compares a strategy here. He starts out, Goliath mocks David's weapon. So David says, okay, you have a sword, a spear, and a javelin. My weapon, you're not seeing my weapon. You see the stick. My weapon is the name of the Lord of hosts. The name of the Lord of armies. The word host in Hebrew is the word armies. And so David has a mighty God. You have mighty weapons. I have a mighty God as my weapon. And then he curses David by his gods. David talks about his God here. It comes in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. And so he responds with his God. And then he warns them that this day, he says, you have defiled this God. And so you've cursed me by your God, but you have defiled the God, the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. And then the Philistine says, I will give your flesh to the birds of the air, to the beasts of the field. David says, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And I will give the carcass of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth. So he says he's going to give, Philistine says he'll give David's flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. David says, I will strike the camp of the Philistines and give them to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth. And the purpose of that is that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. It's not just because you threatened me. It's not just because I want vengeance on you. The purpose is I want the name of the Lord to be known, that there is a God in Israel who protects his people. He goes on to say, then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with the sword or the spear. See, I have this whole group of Israelites behind me, and they're afraid because they see you, and they see you coming out with this challenge every day, and every time you come out, they cower and they run away, and they are afraid because they think that you're this big guy and they can't beat you. And I want this assembly back here to know that the Lord doesn't save using those things that you have. I want them to know that the battle is the Lord's, and that he's going to give you into our hands. David is coming out not just to win a battle, not just to bring glory to David. David wants his brothers, his countrymen, to know the power of God. He wants them to know who God is. How does David know who God is? Well, he's experienced God all along. Remember, he's fought the lion, he's fought the bear, he's seen God protect him. And he's seen that his countrymen are fearful, they're cowering, they don't know who God is. And he's going to show them, by trusting God and watching God act, that this is who God is. And as they watch him, they're going to see God work, and he wants them to experience that power of God. And the whole purpose he's coming out here, and the whole purpose that he's fighting Goliath, is not so Israel can have a victory. It's not so that they can have peace from the Philistines. The whole purpose is that so they can know who God is, and they can know what God's power is, and that God can protect his people if they would just trust in him and believe in him. David's whole goal is not for his glory. It's not for military victory. It's not that Israel would be a great nation. His purpose is that God would be glorified. That's what he's doing this for. That's his whole purpose here. And he's making it plain to everybody here. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. And the whole purpose is that they would know that there is a God in Israel. And that he doesn't deliver by the sword. He doesn't deliver by the spear, the javelin. He doesn't deliver because there's strong people fighting. He delivers because the battle is his. That's what he wants those people to know.
They have gods that they worship, but they're not real gods. But there is a real God in Israel.
There's a living God in Israel, yeah.
There's a real God that actually does.
Deuteronomy 20, 1 through 4. Would somebody turn there and read that for us? Abigail, you're there already? Go ahead.
When you go out to battle against the enemy, and see horses and chariots, and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. So it shall be, when you are on the verge of battle, that the priest shall approach and speak to the people. And you shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are on the verge of battle with your enemy. Do not let your heart be faint. Do not be afraid. Do not tremble or be terrified because of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you, to fight for you against your enemies, to save you.
The priest was supposed to be out there giving this very speech that David was giving to tell the people that God is with you. Don't be afraid. He's going to fight for you. Where was the priest here? Where were the spiritual leaders? They're supposed to be leading the battle. They were absent. It took a shepherd boy to come out and give the speech the priests were supposed to give, that the Lord is going to be with you in the battle and deliver you. Why is David a man after God's own heart? He understood who God was. And he trusted God the way that God wanted his people to trust him. This is the kind of king God wanted for his people. We're going to see David make mistakes along the way as king. But remember this passage. Remember what David did here. We teach David and Goliath to the kids. Oh, David went out. I come to you in the name of the Lord. Boom, he kills the giant. Wee, fun. You know, it's good. The kids need to learn about David and Goliath's faith. But his faith was so strong here. His faith was so great. This is such an example for us. We can't miss that in this passage. He got the point. He understood. I mean, have I emphasized it enough? Marie? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he has advantages like I don't remember if it was Jonathan. You said that he has a speed advantage. He has range. I mean, he has military advantages too. But his big advantage is God is on his side. Just like Jonathan and his armor bearers, like, you know, God can save by many or God can save by a few. It doesn't matter what God has as resources. God can do it because He's God. That's the kind of faith we need to have. That point C there, and I didn't even turn my page, so I have all the stuff in point C, that God does not save with the sword or the spear. The battle is the Lord's. No matter what, you can feel like you're all alone. If you have God on your side, you have the majority. You're good to go. Just do what God wants you to do. Let's move on, because I was hoping maybe I'd get done by 12 because we started so early, and I'm not going to do that, so let's keep moving here. But I'm hoping you get that point there, just David's faith here. 1 Samuel 17:48 through 51. Jonathan, go ahead.
So was when the Philistines arose and came and drew to meet David, that David hastened and ran towards the army to meet the Philistines. That David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he flung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead, so the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistines with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head. And when the Philistines thought their champion was dead, they fled.
So David and Goliath fight. If you want to cross out and Goliath, you can, because Goliath didn't really do much fighting in this.
David ran towards him.
Yeah, they drew near to each other, and you know there it says David hastened, again to Jonathan's point. Goliath probably couldn't do a whole lot of running with all the extra weight he had. And David saves Goliath. He slings the stone into Goliath's forehead. Now, he was wearing this bronze helmet. I'm not sure what kind of helmets the Philistines wore, how much of the head they covered, but he found the soft spot and got the stone into his forehead. And Goliath falls flat on his face, and David beheads Goliath with Goliath's own sword, because David didn't have a sword. He didn't take one into battle. But David predicted when he talked to Goliath that he was going to cut off his head, and he did that. And so the Philistines see that their 9'9" tall champion died, and died to a shepherd boy. And if the shepherd boys of Israel can kill their giants that easily, we need to be scared of their real men, right? So they're panicked and they take off, and they're gone. They're fleeing. Now, what was supposed to happen when Goliath died in the one-on-one battle? Yeah, we'll serve Israel now when our champion dies. No, that didn't happen, right? It's funny how those deals never work out. Anyway, 1 Samuel 17:52. I saw your hand go up, Joanna. You want that one? Do you have a comment?
Yes.
Oh.
think it's important that we see that the first move was on the Philistine's part. The Philistine arose and came toward him. God is defending his anointed David from the attack of the Philistine, not the other way around.
Yeah, the Philistine.
David is not making the first move.
David, yep, that's good. The Philistine arose, came near and drew David, and David hastened and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. Yep.
There's the other thing. He didn't run towards Goliath. It says he ran towards the army to meet the Philistine.
Yeah.
You know what that is.
Well, I think he ran in the direction of the army towards the Philistine, so I think he,
Anyway.
yeah.
First move is on his.
Okay, go ahead, Joanna. So 11, I have the result of the battle. This is a nice summary of the plunder. Israel pursues the Philistines. They plunder the Philistines. David takes Goliath's head to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem wasn't in control of the Israelites at this time. The Jebusites were still there. Some commentators say that the Jebusites were kind of nasty people towards Israel and kind of in league with the Philistines a little bit, and so maybe David took the head of the giant there to kind of taunt them a little bit and say, hey, you guys calm down a little bit. We just defeated the Philistines. Yeah. But David takes Goliath's armor to his own tent. That would be in Bethlehem, to his home. This is spoils of war for him. Kind of, hey, look, I got guy's armor. Bronze is nice stuff, so if he takes it home with him, that's his reward for slaying the giant.
I can put a comment here, which is the last point we fought with. David was the first guided missile in armor history.
The first guy what?
Guided missile. God directed that shot and put it right where he wanted it.
Right where he wanted it.
Most effective.
Well, and David probably, I don't know how much you do watching sheep, but I'm sure he practiced a little bit with the sling and got pretty good at hitting things with it. So I would care to guess that David would be considered what you'd say an expert with the sling, and it came in handy. Okay, last section, verses 55 through 58. Nathan. So Saul gathers some more information. So Saul asks, whose son is this guy? Now he's asking Abner. Who's Abner? His uncle, right, remember? You probably don't remember, but when he was going through his commanders and his family history, Abner is Saul's uncle, also the commander of his army. He doesn't recognize that David is the son of Jesse. Why doesn't he recognize that David is the son of Jesse? The servant who recruited David said, I know this guy, the son of Jesse, who's a shepherd boy. Why would he not remember that? He had an evil spirit at the time. He was in anguish. I've had these migraine problems, some of you know about them. And sometimes people are telling me stuff when I have these bad migraines, and all I hear is, take some medicine. And they say, remember I told you that? I'm like, no, my head was aching. It's probably something like this. He's probably just a guy with a harp. Yeah, go get the guy with the harp. That's great. Do that. I mean, he has other things on his mind. So, why didn't he recognize it? It's David. Well, is David the harper in the palace, in palace clothes, not David the shepherd in shepherd's clothes, or David the warrior killing giants? Saul didn't make the connection. He's a king. He has lots to do. So he doesn't recognize David very well, okay? It's explainable. There's a lot going on in Saul's life. So he doesn't recognize David. He asks Abner. Abner doesn't recognize him. Abner is the commander of the army. He doesn't care who the harper is in the palace. So I don't know. So they inquire who David is. David comes back from the battle, and he stands before Saul, and he's like, whose son are you? Oh, I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Oh, okay, great. So now Saul knows. So that's some of the explanations. So you can see that Saul has other things going on. David probably was one of many armor bearers, so it's not unexplainable that he didn't recognize David when he came and volunteered. Takeaways. David shows faith based on who God is. That's the faith that we're supposed to have, based on who God is. That's kind of a silly statement, I guess. David did not look at the circumstances that were set up against him, a giant with powerful weapons, but saw the God who was in control of all things and who owned the battle. He put trust in the one who would be able to deliver him from the enemy. We oftentimes trust in what we see around us. We oftentimes trust in our circumstances. We oftentimes trust in what we can do and what our abilities are instead of putting our trust in the living God, instead of putting our trust in the Lord of hosts, instead of putting our trust in the God who is able to deliver us. And when we put our trust in ourselves and our circumstances and the things around us, we fail. Our focus needs to be on God. Our trust needs to be on Him. David is a wonderful example. By human measure, there's no way this little shepherd boy should be able to slay this mighty giant, even with the advantages he had. A rock to the forehead doesn't normally kill people.
When we think of a sling, I don't really sound like right against it on your shoulder. One of the things we think of a slingshot.
I know it's a...
If one like this, and when you swing that thing around your head or around your shoulder or however it does it, and you release that comes off of it with such velocity. If he's within...
But you have a guy with a shield in front of him. You have a helmet. You have armor. You have a once-in-a-lifetime shot that's good at...
Right. That's only... See, here's...
there's
a couple of things that really amazes me. Where's his armor bearer?
He's probably like,
And his armor bearer man that stands in front of him to protect him from stuff like that.
Yeah.
It doesn't show him being there. He's out in front.
There's amazing circumstances that made this happen. But
when you get hit,
it's a once-in-a-lifetime shot.
Guided missile.
So I'm saying that,
Yeah.
it's his trust in God that really won that battle. It wasn't David's mighty work that did it.
It was not his skill. It was just the fact that God put that, directed that.
It's like you said. It was a God-guided missile that did that.
Right. But the thing is that rock will kill the individual that hit in the right place.
In the perfect shot.
Perfect shot.
Yep. That's what I'm trying to say, is it's that perfect shot that did that. And we need to trust God in our lives in that same way. Even if it's not a life and death situation like against the giant, even in the daily situation, that's the kind of trust we need to have in God. And then the second thing, David was able to remember what God had done for him in the past and build upon it. With the lions and the bears here. He knew God could deliver him from Goliath because God had already delivered him from the lion and the bear. We can reflect on what God has done in our lives and see that God has been faithful and we can trust Him. And you might be sitting there saying, my life's been hard. God hasn't done a lot in my life. I'm going to argue, if you're going to be honest in your life, you can look back and you can see God working. Even in hard times, you can see God working. I'm going to argue that just because you're here now, and if you've trusted Christ as your Savior, there's been things in your life that God has done and God's protected you and God's brought you to this point that maybe everything hasn't been great in your life. Maybe you've gone through hard times and trials, but God has worked in your life. And you can build upon those things. And I'm not saying your life is perfect. My life hasn't been perfect. I've gone through hard times. I've gone through trials in my life. I've gone through difficulties in my life. And I'm not going to say that everything has been a bed of roses. I can go and say my life has been so smooth and easy and joyful and everything. That's not true. But I can look back and see how God has worked. I can build upon that and say God has worked and God has guided me and God has protected me through many things that at the time, even at the hard times, I didn't know what God was doing, but now I can look back and say God worked through that. And we can build upon that and build our faith upon that, just like David did in his life. So any thoughts or questions? Now, the other things that, look at the other thing you can look at here, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but like Eliab and Goliath, both of them kind of mocked and taunted David. And I think those are very typical attacks of how people and how even Satan tries to attack us. So you can look at those things and say, hey, we can be attacked in those ways, and just kind of see how those are typical attacks, and just kind of say, okay, I know those are coming. I can brush those off and know that that's how I'm going to be attacked. And just look at, okay, those are typical attacks. I can brush them off if that's not true. Let me go on and focus on what's true and what God wants me to do. So, anyway. Okay, nothing else. Ted, will you close with some prayer?
Okay, Father, we just thank